Patrick Haughton's back garden at Penryn near Falmouth. We're walking down to his studio. Patrick was born in Devon and studied art in Bristol during the early 60s, and after a lengthy teaching career in Cornish schools is now pursuing his chosen career as a painter, and is indeed producing some of the finest work of his career in a geometric, constructed abstract style. His work does, however, despite its advanced abstraction, refer to the maritime and natural environment of southwest Cornwall. He uses the classic driftwood and found objects on a Cornish beach and incorporates them into the quite stringent and classically ordered compositions. Paddy, in your work there's a dynamic between the 2 and 3 dimensional, between graphic, linear, rhythmic design and extension into the 3rd dimension using collage material, or if you're in a more classical mood, then pre-prepared geometrical elements which build up as it were, a bas-relief or semi-sculptural surface. So I think your work has a oscillation between formal and expressive or sensual characteristics. Has this always been there?
I think perhaps it has been. I mean, there was a long hiatus, really, between my student period and the work done then, which was heavily influenced by William Scott, on the one hand, Morandi on another, still life being a major part of it. And the concerns were of a certain stillness, of certain quietude. And I suppose I found my way back to that. I mean, and we're looking at a time shift of more than 10 years, during which I was engaged with primarily with teaching and just kept painting ticking over. The discovery of making things, making works of art incorporating found objects, was one that came to me. It came to me on a beach with an old friend who picked something up and made a remark, and that led me to start collaging these things. And I suppose what I started to find was that I could communicate ideas about landscape by using actual pieces, if you like, of the landscape, or things found within the landscape, things that have been weathered by the elements. And these things had a reality about them that helped to evoke that sort of spirit of place or whatever. The later reliefs, what you refer to as the more classical ones, the ones built up out of pre-cut sheets of hardboard, pre-cut and glued together and assembled reliefs, which then in the process of making them very often will be recarved at various stages. Not unknown for a piece to almost be resolved. You know, the situation where a work is, you think resolved and then you realise it isn't, and then metaphorically taking an axe to it, or rather a sharp blade and a chisel to it, and carving new sections out. And in doing that, one is trying to infuse that kind of the reality of the real object into them, and as I was saying, also incorporating sometimes the occasional real fragment into the piece. And I did do a series, which I think you refer to in the book, where I actually pierced the picture frame, and rather than mounting or assembling objects on the picture surface, was actually recessing things into pockets. That's over 10 years ago I started doing those pieces.
Now that use of inverted collage, where the object is put into a kind of recession behind the picture plane, does rather trigger the timeless debate about flat design and illusionism, the illusion of space and things going back. It's almost like you're saying, is this a real object, or is it an image of a depiction of a real object? So you're playing games with the nature of perception and illusion, if you like, and also with sculpture and painting.
Yes.
Or the intermediate area between those two plastic disciplines.
Well, the fascinating thing there, because as you so rightly say, there's a playful element in it, and playing games between illusion and space. But what I particularly enjoy, of course, is the fact that it is real space and they are real objects, and integrating them into that situation, if you like, so that there is still a unity, there is still a wholeness, and quite a difficult process, really, because you're beginning with these objects and then cutting a slot, which is rarely a rectangle. In the later pieces, certainly, they were not rectangular slots; they were holes related to the shape of the object. So you set that situation up maybe with 4 objects in 4 holes in the centre of a large square, and that is then immutable. That's there. So there is something of that, the carving of a sculpture almost going on, in that you are reacting against those. You have to work with those things, but you also have to work against them. And the one thing you can't really do is alter them once they're there. The only alteration is when the pieces, which happen with a couple, totally reject it and ends up on the bonfire. But an interesting situation, and in a way that does reflect on all the rest of the work too. I suppose part of the reason for working with relief and real objects is you create something, you make something, you build something first, and then everything you do with paint has to in some way relate to that and struggle against it. So it's, you're setting yourself a problem.
And have you ever thought about extending even further into the third dimension and actually maybe making constructions that aren't so much wall-bound and therefore pictorial, but are freestanding? Or have you always wanted to stay within the realms of pictorialism?
Curiously, yes, is the simple answer. I have thought about it. I've often been tempted. I've never actually launched into it in a large way. I did make a couple of pieces quite a few years ago for a Newlyn show, which is called Off the Wall, where I found some large timber frames from an old boat which curved up against the wall, the 2 of them side by side. And then there was a construction built onto the head of each of these, so they were like sculptures leaning against the wall, but then they also had a square set, diamond-like, if you like, set behind the main sort of part of it. And then I also played games with large boulders which were slung in bits of rope, which swung, so they were kind of mobile sculptures incorporating found objects. So that was an interesting thing, and I enjoyed doing it, but I never took it any further. But if I go back to your comments on cubism, curious thing is that where I feel I'm going now, and there are some small pieces in the studio, some small collage mixed media pieces that I made, one on holiday in Brittany. And I am quite drawn now to the idea of making, and that's why I've got some large canvases ready, making some larger scale pieces which incorporate some elements of cubist collage, if you like. Possibly also, if I can find the ways in which I want to do it, incorporating perhaps even large pieces of timber, which would obviously have to go right across the entire canvas and secure to the stretchers. But that's just what I'm going to attempt. We shall have to see how that actually pans out.
This work here has the final uppermost collaged element, 2 or 3 levels up from the actual painting surface, appears like a found object. So that little part of the picture is not painted by you, is it? It's natural weathering from a boat or from a...
It is indeed, yes. It is a fragment
of a boat that's fallen apart somewhere down in the creek. No, I didn't paint that red piece with the yellow colour showing through. However, I have played with it a little. I've cut it to shape, and also I've worked on it with a sandpaper to release more of the yellow underpainting. So I have actually done something with it, and you haven't spotted that there's a second piece of wood abutting that, which is also a piece of plywood with a trace of, which is sort of greyish colour, with a trace of blue and a sort of blackish from a bit of burning, I think, which has then been overpainted, which is...
And by choosing it for your artwork, you have bestowed upon it, Duchamp style, the status of a work of art, and therefore you've validated the fact that you're the author of it.
I suppose, yes, we must have the reference to Duchamp, I suppose, although other people have played with objects, real objects. I prefer a comparison with Picasso, although not for reasons of personal glory so much as I prefer Picasso as an artist. That happens, but the pieces are chosen. They're chosen for their reference to where they came from and for the kind of things they are. That they are both, as with this whole set of work, they are things that come from the coast. They are parts of the voyage, if you like. And the two pieces, in fact, that are related, are both called Return to Harbour. So we've got bits of washed timbers that have been washed back in after a wreck, if you like, and then are reconstituted and put into a situation where there is a horizon, there is some reference to landscape which places them. And then, of course, there are the formal elements of actually playing with the colours that are found within the objects, the greys and the reds and the yellows, which are re-employed and then offset against the blues.
There's such a stringency in your mode of ordering these little fragments and elements that, such factors of whether you've directly painted or whether they've been found is immaterial, because the overall organisation of the surface is typically you and very stringent.
Yes.
There's a tightness, there's a sort of compactness which is still able to suggest infinite space.
Yeah. Picking up that earlier point about the ordering of the things and the making of them, and organising them into a work of art, seems to me is actually fundamentally different from what Duchamp was saying. Duchamp was actually saying, here is an object, and I christened this a work of art because I've named it as a work of art. Whereas I'm saying these are raw materials which I will assemble, which I will build into something which speaks some kind of message I wanted to speak, and becomes a work of art through that. In fact, I've got a rooted objection to the idea that I could have picked up one of these pieces of wood and just presented that and said that's the work of art. That would be too facile, I think, for me, for my taste anyway. So this is another piece. So another piece in the same series, also called Return to Harbour, and you can see, for a start, it's made out of the very same elements. I quite like the idea that I had a sort of fragment of boat, if you like, and cut it up into pieces and then assembled a pair. So in fact there were 6 pieces altogether, which are 3 pairs. And a lot of the questions you asked, in a way, the answers read the previous piece. It's a twin. So it's a variation on a theme, really, isn't it? It's that kind of musical game. And then one of the others of a similar series, and these were called, I have to look on the back to see, From a Distant Shore. Well, yes, again, title is fairly self-explanatory there. It's that delicate balance, again, that you were talking about earlier, between things that have their abstract, formal quality as a piece, and yet somehow refer to landscape without the thing becoming too overt. And this is almost borderline, I feel. That's as far as I want it to go in terms of saying, you know, here's a cliff, and here's sea, and here's a horizon.
There's a much cooler colour key in this particular work. It's blues and greys and whites.
Yes, yeah.
There's again the intersection of drawn line with relief outline going into a third dimension, and also the way line traverses a piece of geometry or traverses a zone of colour.
Yeah.
And then creates a subdivision, like
Yeah.
a different colour within it. And therefore you're getting this kind of world within a world, if you like, but not in terms of conventional perspective on a landscape space, but in terms of plasticity, if you like,
And there was a purely formal problem that I encountered. I'm going back sort of 10 years or so, around the time I suppose maybe when we first met, and at that time I was making a lot of large-scale relief works, usually heavily reliant on found objects, and at the same time I was producing the first linear drawings, which were really exploring that language that Nicholson and Alex Mackenzie and others have used so successfully, in learning to use that. And then came the problem. Now I seem to be doing two different things. How do we gradually marry those into a language that coheres and works and is true for me? So that's starting to happen in pieces like this, although, I mean, yes, I say starting to happen, it is happening in these, and it's happened in some of the other pieces that are around us in the studio, but it was a relatively late development, and there are still things, quite a lot of things, that I'm trying to discover how to do, which is the best way to be, I suspect. So, should we take this one?
And the last of that little set of four.
Again, it's the pair of the other, as you can see. For my money, slightly more successful. There's a little conceit in there from a distant shore. The what looks like coal dust from Wales. It isn't. It's Lanzarote sand.
Right.
So there's a little pun there to do with distant shores. I particularly enjoy, when working on these kind of things, there's sort of delicate shade or delicate variations on white, sort of through creams and greys and whites. I always enjoy playing with those sort of things. So there's a playful sort of element to creating all of these. I mean, the first being gluing things together, and then gradually building up the composition. And in fact, there's a shallow relief which is barely discernible there, which is using acrylic with a heavy medium and masking tape, masking off areas and building up a very shallow relief, which I've played with that idea on occasion as well.
It's almost halfway between Schwitters and Nicholson.
Yes. The comparison with Schwitters is, I made some pieces once, there was a show when we were asked to do pieces, commissioned to do pieces which were about identity, and in them I did use old bus tickets and bits and pieces like that God knows why I had them sitting around in places. But when I'm using them, I'm actually still telling the story of, this is the bus ticket from A to B, and I was there, and this is where I was going. So it's about that, rather than having any sort of agenda beyond simply saying this is what I'm about or this is what I've done.